Recording this, and I just saw the recording button go up. There we go. So I am Ann Missoni. I'm the Dean of the school at the International Center of Photography. And welcome to you all. I want to start by thanking the Society for Photographic Education, who we remain affiliated with, and who has been generous enough to let us use their Zoom account. SPE is a member-based organization. For those of you who aren't familiar, we'll be dropping their website in the chat window momentarily. For those of you who are new to FotoFika, please put your email address in the chat window directed to me so that I can share with you in the future any updates we have about additional programs beyond our social media posts. I promise you we aren't selling our email list to anybody. I promise you that it is, it is really just every 2 weeks letting you know what's coming up next. A few protocol reminders. We do have you all on mute and ask that you stay on mute during the presentation portion of the meeting. We'll open it up to the larger audience once we've completed presentations, so stay on mute until then. Once we wrap up presentations, please do stick around as there will hopefully be a very lively, informal conversation. We ask you though to also present your questions in the chat feature so that we can help facilitate the conversation for our guests, and also so that if there's any information that comes across in the chat, we can preserve it for updating on our blog post. All right, so I say this every week. I do mean it. We are establishing the way to move forward in this shifting time. We can do this together. Over to you, John.
Hey, everybody. My name is John Fryer, and I am going to just talk a little bit about some of the things that we've been working on. And also I want to highlight a few things. So I have a double role as one of the founders of FotoFika, but I'm also a new board member on for the Society for Photographic Education. So one of the things I just want to highlight, just sharing my screen, which is what I constantly do when I'm here. And this is kind of exciting for SPE, and it's exciting just in general. So, one of the things that happened this year is that we had to cancel our conference, our in-person conference in Denver, but we had done all of the work related to that conference in terms of doing peer review and so on, in terms of going through all the proposals, and we were able to select proposals. And tomorrow night, we're having a virtual town hall meeting for all the membership of SPE, where we're going to lay out an entire year's worth of programming. So people who have applied to present at our conference, they've been accepted. They've been scheduled on either a Tuesday night or a Saturday afternoon. And we're just basically going to have weekly programming, if we count FotoFika, for all of 2021. So that's a very exciting thing. So if you're a member of SPE, the town hall is coming this week, or is coming tomorrow at 7 p.m. And then if you go to the events page, all of the upcoming events are being added. So, if you're scheduling your life, Tuesday nights are going to be photo related throughout this year. And Saturday afternoons, not all of them, will be photo related. The next event on a Saturday, we're actually having a Zoom-based photo portfolio throwdown, and that's open to all members of SPE. And so,
John,
yeah,
I have a quick question about the town hall meeting. So this is a really, maybe I'm stating the obvious or asking the obvious. This is a place where people can come and really maybe ask questions and give their opinions about what they'd like to see. Is that, that's town hall.
This is the town hall. So
Okay.
I expect there will be questions and answers and challenges. And, our last town hall was something that made us, change direction on a few different things and get our ass in gear. So, I welcome that.
Okay.
So I put the events there. So bringing from my my board member hat back to FotoFika, SPE has agreed to be the fiscal sponsor for our Kickstarter project for the FotoFika All Stars that we have been working on for just about a year. I'm not sure exactly when we started, maybe in March. It's been, it's almost been a year. And this thing will launch. This is just the preview of it. And I can't send you a link to it because it doesn't exist outside of logging in for us, but it should launch. We're just about to submit it so that it has a 3-day turnaround to be approved by Kickstarter. So we're really excited to get that launched because we've been working on it forever. And I think I've used up enough of our time, and I'm going to pass it to Betsy.
All right. Hi, everyone. So we are really excited today to welcome Marianna Chiokan. Oh my gosh. This is why we were having a discussion about language and pronunciations. She's graciously agreed to come talk. We have been talking for a while, Anne and John and I, about talking about mental health in the classroom. I think right now, in the kind of the dead of winter in February, in the middle of a pandemic, is probably, we couldn't find more of a perfect time to talk about this. And I think my idea was like, let's just get everyone around and we just talk. And John and Anne were like, maybe we should get someone who has a little bit of professional experience about this. And so this is why we asked Marianna to come. Also, I think this is a conversation that we could continue to, it's not a one-off thing. And I think that there's a special situation in the art classroom too. I was just saying to them before we started that just today I had a student talk in front of class about how her best friend from childhood died of what she thinks was a drug overdose 2 weeks ago. And so maybe that's unusual, but I think probably all of us have pretty regular, intense interactions in our classroom and things that don't happen in most science classes or even most humanities classes. So anyway, so these were some of the reasons that we invited her. So I will give you a little bit of an introduction. God, why sometimes I am so awkward. So Marianna Chiokan is a licensed mental health counselor, a nationally certified counselor, and a certified Gestalt therapist. Oh my, I can't even say Gestalt. So anyway, I will stop talking and hand it over to you.
Thank you, Betsy. I think you did great. It's perfect. Thank you so much for inviting me. And hi, Felicia. It's nice to see a familiar face. So I am, I see a lot of my own face. That's weird. Okay, better. So I'm a licensed mental health counselor. I've been practicing for over a decade now. I have a bunch of other letters behind my name that Betsy mentioned. And so I'm excited. I'm always happy to talk about mental health. I am always excited to talk about different approaches, different modalities, different ways that I, as a therapist, work with people, and the potential that each of one of my clients that I work with are able to kind of discover about themselves. And essentially, I kind of frame my work of, I like to help people get really excited and really curious about discovering themselves and their own process. So I'm, again, very excited to talk about mental health. There are specific things that Anne, John, and Betsy wanted to for me to touch on, at least for today. And so the first one is specifically about the stigma around mental health. I think I'm in New York. A lot of people, at least, especially in their 30s, I think in the 20s, 30s, younger generations, they're so comfortable around the idea of going to therapy. I literally at some point in my practice recognized that any client that would come in for a consultation over the age of, let's say, I would say like 35 and above, they were coming in with a specific issue, like a concrete, like I have depression, they have a diagnosis, or they are stuck dealing with something that has been habitually part of their lives. Now I see people coming in where, yes, I have anxiety, yeah, I get depressed, but ultimately I just want to find a way to live my best life. I want to improve my relationships. I don't necessarily struggle with like severe, terrible things, but I want to improve my relationship. So and that speaks to, to me, that's a reflection of how open people are now becoming around utilizing support, and how less resistant the newer generations are, which is amazing, because that's who, like, why would you not want to get support? Okay, so the best way to fight stigma is just to talk about things. And that's what we're here to do. So I think a lot of the bad rap that comes for mental health comes from, unfortunately, media. I have a very large chip on my shoulders around how my profession is represented in most films, in shows. I recently taught an ethics class for mental health counselors, and I had one of the assignments was that they had to bring in clips of films, movies, whatever, that represented a mental health professional that highlighted some specific ethical challenge, or several of them. Needless to say, it was a class of around 20 students. Needless to say, none of them had issues finding anything, because for some reason, therapists have horrible rap that we do a lot of shady stuff, which is unfortunately also contributing to the stigma, where I've often had people come in and kind of say things to me that, well, if I go to therapy, I'll discover that I'm crazy, or like they will find something horrible about, and so on and so forth. So again, there's a lot of lack in understanding. So there, wanted to talk about the differences in the letters, the different modalities just a bit, and the different settings. So I'm a licensed mental health counselor, and I'm also a Gestalt therapist. And so what that basically means is that at some point, upon researching different ways that I can work clinically with people, I ruled out going after PhD or PsyD, and as well as MD. So generally speaking, there are we can say three categories. One is psychiatrists. So those are doctors, those are medical doctors whose training is primarily based on prescribing medicine for specific, obviously they get trained in diagnosis, but their entire purpose is to assess the patient and find the most appropriate medicine for the symptoms. Very few of those people, very few psychiatrists actually get formal training in psychotherapeutic modalities. When I was working on inpatient hospital unit, I had firsthand experiences of residents having disclosed that, oh yeah, I took a weekend course in cognitive behavioral therapy. Let me assure you that a weekend course in any therapeutic modality is a drop in an ocean. It does not prepare any professional, anyone, to adequately provide mental health or psychotherapeutic support. Even CBT, which CBT is probably like the easiest to get access to. So those are doctors, those are psychiatrists, primarily for medicine. Really helpful, but primarily for medicine. Then we go into a doctorate territory. So that would be PhDs and PsyDs. And so the primary difference between those two is that PhD is Doctor of Philosophy. So this is obviously going to be educational training that prepares professionals for teaching, doing specific research, doing studies, testing out the different treatment modalities, like to see how effective is CBT for this class of this population. How effective is, I don't know, they could work with psychiatrists, say this medicine for substance abuse, what are the symptoms, so on and so forth. Some of the PhD programs do offer specific clinical perspective. So a lot of PhD level clinicians do get additional training and become and work with people psychotherapeutically, in addition to perhaps teaching or doing other research. So they can see patients or clients. PsyD is different from PhD because it is a longer process, it is a longer training, and it specifically focuses on clinical work. So it's, I think it's 5 years usually. It's less focused on developing your own research. It is more clinically oriented. Usually the programs, however, tend to focus on one specific modality, and I'll get into modalities a little bit later. So they still teach. Some PsyDs still get involved in research to some effect, but it is much more clinically oriented. I'm sure that, I mean, it all kind of like overlaps at some point. Yeah, anyway. So then we're going to drop into the next layer, which is master's level, which is me. And like, I think, Betsy, you mentioned the terminal degrees in the arts. So my degree is also a terminal degree in mental health counseling. So some of the other ones that exist, I'm sure you're familiar, LMSW, LCSW. So those are social workers. LCAT, which is licensed clinical arts therapist. LP, licensed psychoanalyst, and finally LMFT. So that's a licensed family and marriage therapist. So we're getting like really specialized, really specific here. So typically social workers, the focus of their training is really focused on the social elements. So we're talking about curriculum that has human development in mind. And psychological theories, kind of generally speaking, the focus is really on creating society and creating communities and finding out resources and supports and connecting people to those resources and supports. It is really about utilizing utilizing the society, the larger group. LCATs, I actually know the least about this one, ironically, but this is licensed creative arts therapist. Creative arts therapist. So also, obviously utilizing arts, developmental theories is involved. They do typically have other modalities that are part of their trainings, but the primary modality, the primary way of working is through artistic expression, and that varies. That could be obviously speaking to an audience within art. So it could be movement. I have one of my close colleagues. She is a somatic. She's a creative arts therapist, and she has a PhD specifically in somatic work. So she does a lot of body-oriented movement, and I think her specialty is like authentic movement. I know plenty. I have another colleague who works primarily with sketching and drawing as part of his practice. So it's a very specific way of working as well. Licensed psychoanalysts. I don't know how many people are familiar with psychoanalysts, but that is the most classic way that people know about psychotherapy, through Freud. There's a contemporary psychoanalysis these days. It's not necessarily a blank slate, but it typically focuses on your background, your upbringing, your childhood experiences, and how that impacted you, how that still impacts you now in your current day. And licensed marriage and family therapist, the specialty is self-explanatory. They primarily work with couples and with families. They will work with individuals, but it's always the focus is how does this individual fit in within the larger family or the group. Finally, you get to mine. And the reason why I picked mine, my license track, is because licensed mental health counselors get exposure to all of these things. So I figured I'm just gonna not pigeonhole myself. And I got training in psychodynamic psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral psychotherapy, experiential psychotherapy, and family and couples. Later on, after I graduated, I completed a clinical fellowship in Gestalt psychotherapy specifically, which falls under experiential psychodynamic modality. So, okay, I kind of want to take a breath here. I know that I just like spewed a whole bunch of technical jargon at you. I don't know how that's landing, if it's useful, if it's relevant, if anyone has questions.
We're academics, so it's
familiar territory. Any questions?
Yeah, please feel free to unmute yourself if you have any questions or drop them in the chat. Either is certainly welcomed.
Well, I mean, I would say I would have a question of, what's the best practice, with the example that Betsy brought, right? Somebody confides or brings that information to you. What are the things that we should be thinking about or watching for in terms of, being sensitive to mental health with that particular person?
Right. Yeah, that's I thank you for the question, because I also realized that, yes, what I do, my field, and what you are confronted with, that they're kind of different and the roles differ. And we touched on that before to some extent. But in that situation, it's really, I think, the issue of boundaries comes up, right? Because you as educators have a specific role that you play in your students' life. And so while you may be cognizant on a personal level of, that may probably be quite traumatic, or maybe not, or it could bring up a lot of feelings or not. But then how do I navigate that? How do I negotiate that? And so this is actually that's a really great example, because it does bring up the complexity and how murky these situations that you're finding yourself, that you may find yourself in, could be. So in those kinds of settings, especially in educational settings, what I would suggest is could be useful to familiarize yourself with the colleges or whatever setting you're in, what their counseling services may be, because it's not necessarily on you, it's not necessarily your responsibility to intervene. Because in intervening, sometimes, even though we may be we are well-meaning, we may inevitably cross some boundaries for someone. And that becomes a really challenging decision-making process.
Well, this example, because she was very open, and I don't think that there was a problem. And in fact, I think if I had said in the middle of class, oh, if you need to go to therapy, the counseling office, this is here, I think she might have felt like, I'm talking about my art project. But I do think that having that available, maybe not even specific to that situation, like maybe I should integrate it into my class all the time to make sure, like, I don't know, would you suggest that, like, one of the things, if we have classes that tend to provoke things, but we don't necessarily see anything that is demanding action at that moment, but somehow integrate this idea. I mean, I did start the day by saying, oh my God, it's the middle of February. How's everyone doing? And maybe I should have said, there's a counseling office in case anyone wants it. I mean, part of my question is how to integrate this in a way that doesn't make them uncomfortable. In terms of, like, I want them to still share. Like, I want them to be open, and I don't want them to be thinking, they need to go to the therapist. But at the same time,
Can I ask a question, Betsy? Does your school like have you do any kind of check-ins? So for example, I've been teaching as an adjunct at Lesley in Cambridge, and they actually ask us to report in, like a month in, they ask us to let them know if there are any students who might be struggling. And there's like we use this system called Advisor Track, and you kind of submit what you think the issue is. And both the student and their advisor gets a copy of that email.
Wow.
Yeah, and like within it, you have the ability to say what the issue is, like absenteeism or acting out, and then what you think the recommendation should be. So, I mean, that's how Lesley has tried to kind of intercede. And so you can do that throughout the semester, even through the end.
I'm actually talking about Emerson right now, across the river from you. And they just, today I got, just tell me which students aren't showing up kind of thing. So it doesn't go nearly as far. No, that would be a good thing. And maybe even just doing it ourselves, right? Like somehow, but I'll check and see if they have anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, I only knew about it because the people running the program that I'm in, they send out an email, and just say, remember, let us know, because they also, I guess, are being hyper vigilant too. So they have a committee that, because I was mostly teaching first year students and transfer students. So they're hyper vigilant about, making sure those kids aren't falling through the cracks and getting them help sooner rather than later.
Yeah, no, that's good to think about.
What you started to say, Betsy, made me think of, all that stuff we have to put in our syllabus now. Religious holidays.
Yeah.
I mean, we should just be adding that in. I mean, I think all of us would be a great idea to go to our departments and say, hey, we should just add in the link to counseling services. I don't know how many times over the last 20 years I have, sent someone to counseling service because they came into my office hours and were having a meltdown. And I've even walked people over to counseling services, or walked over to counseling services myself when people were reluctant, sent them a selfie of the friendly people at the desk, hey, they're really nice. You can come on over. But it's like, well, why have we not thought about just having that be part of our syllabus? I think that's a great step to just make that and do it and send it to our directors of our department and be like, hey, we should really have this in our syllabus all the time.
And at VCU, we have a syllabus statement that is specifically from the school, for the School of the Arts that does that. So it talks about the Wellness Resource Center, it talks about counseling and all direct links. So that is a way. I mean, I think when we talk about stigma reduction, if in every class people are going over the syllabus and they're going over some of these pieces, it does give it gives also an opportunity for me as an educator to reflect on any of these things, right? So one of the things that it's included in our syllabus statement, it's the counseling center, it's the wellness resource center, and it's a collegiate recovery program called Rams in Recovery. So when I hit those in class and they say, oh, the counseling center, there's a great counseling center here. I visited it myself. Rams in Recovery is a great organization. I'm an advisor to it. So to make it so that, again, familiarizing myself, but if we do that with the resources that are there. And then Liz, the warm handoff is something that's highly recommended in terms of, bringing somebody specifically there so that it's not something they put on their list to never do.
So Marianna, that gets me to thinking about some of the things that we talked about in getting you familiar with FotoFika, which is that clearly some schools have quite a bit of in the way of resources and protocols that are established. Clearly, as arts educators, we see our fair share of mental health issues that come up through the work that our students are making. Also, the just statistics that are a part of our population of students. But one of the things that you also have clearly stated is this idea of boundaries and when and how or if we should, in fact, make that point of engagement. That sometimes we can emphasize something to the point where somebody becomes resistant, but also that we are not therapists, we are not mental health counselors, and that the work that needs to be done is something that needs to be in the hands of the appropriate individuals. And so navigating that very difficult space between the critique of the work and then also the mental health of the student who is making that work.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. And I think it's especially challenging in your role because art is often one of the ways that people are able to express themselves, express parts of themselves that they are unable to articulate. And so oftentimes you can be on the receiving end of witnessing somebody's inner psychic process unfolding in front of your eyes, right? Or their process in manifesting in their work and all of the feelings or whatever that could also bring up for them. And I can appreciate the challenge of having to navigate this territory. The place where I see kind of a bit of a potential overlap of way to transition, perhaps, is to encourage. I'm not familiar. I don't know how to be an art educator, but I imagine that there probably are some opportunities where you can encourage your student to explore their own work. And that is not something that necessarily is limited to the classroom, that can also extend beyond that. So in that way, what emerges in the classroom, in their own work, it does not have to be only limited to that area. They can use what emerges in the classroom to take it to their therapist, to take it to a counseling office, to continue to explore it, what drives it. And then it becomes a process of self-inquiry that they will then build on further and further.
You're bringing up an interesting point too, that comes back to, I think, what you said at the beginning, that I wrote down generational. And I think that there is more of a sense, there's more fluidity between this idea of mental health and making art, and that there's not necessarily this hard line where people think either, and my student today, she was actually really trying to figure out whether this was too fresh for her to include in the art that she's making right now. So it was already contextualized that way. And I think she actually expressed it in front of the whole class. But I do think that that's interesting too. And I also feel like therapy and art really, they ultimately are different processes. You talked about the overlap. And I think it's tricky for us sometimes in the classroom to know at what point do we grab their hand, like Liz talks about, and take them, and what time do we just have to step back. Go ahead. I want to flip it into something else that we've talked about that I want to ask about, but
yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, on Saturday when we were talking, we got to the next step, which was our mental health, which was, we started talking, and I actually thought, hey, wow, that's an interesting thing to think about. I don't know how to turn it into a question. Yeah. I'm so bad at that.
So I think that if I remember correctly, there was, I don't know, do you want to disclose the situation?
Sure.
The example?
Yeah.
Yeah. So why don't you, and then we can just build on that.
What was it?
So I think so. I remember what I remember was that you had an interaction with a student who had a very intense emotional outlet or outburst.
Oh yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. And actually going through really complex experience, and I became kind of the focus of this person's wrath, and because of some complex nature of the situation, the university had to support this person and wasn't able to support me. So I ended up being, it was almost like a him versus me kind of situation. And so they chose the student's mental health over mine, basically, the student's situation. I am being a little bit vague. And I've kind of pushed it away because I didn't really think about my mental health being part of that. But it's like several years later, and I actually still have anger about it, which I was like, oh, okay, like there's something there. So especially in this, I think this situation now in the classroom where we're, as we should be, we're being taught to be very aware of students' perspectives and where they're coming from and different backgrounds and ways in which we need to be careful and inclusive, and missteps sometimes or misunderstanding. I think a lot of us carry a little bit of anxiety about making wrong steps. And I think I'm being kind of vague. How do we take care of ourselves, right? Without, should we pay attention to our own mental health? I mean, I guess these are the questions. How do we pay attention to our own mental health? How do we make it not us versus them either, right? And can we depend on our institutions to support us that way?
Yeah, it's. I think that unfortunately that's not a foreign concept to me, and I don't think that that's just limited to specifically being in education. I think my own experiences. I think that even when I was going through my, when I was working towards my licensure, I think that there aren't often adequate supports for providers, whether you are a provider of education or provider of any other kind of service, whatever it is that you do. So I think ultimately it falls on each individual, on us, to ensure that we seek the best, the most appropriate support for ourselves, because especially when it comes to therapy. So as Betsy brought up the example of, like, there was a situation where you didn't necessarily feel supported and still have feelings about it, and so what I will say is the feelings that come up in my world, that's called countertransference, right? Especially if it's in relationship to something your student is doing. So that would be whatever feelings I'm having around whatever my patient is reporting, right? It is
Right.
Ethically, it is my responsibility to get supervision in my own therapy to address that so that it doesn't interfere in my work. And I think that can probably be generalized to you. Now, I actually think, as far as institution, I don't know how many institutions actually offer these kinds of services. I mean, counseling services for students, yes, I think that that's probably more common. But as far as supportive mental health services for the faculty, I've never heard of it. Maybe that exists. I have no idea. But ultimately, I wouldn't want to rely, because then you're limited to that provider for as long as you're employed there. So I think that it's incredibly important to find the right person for you to work with that can adequately support you and allow for you to process whatever comes up. Yeah.
So just to say something about that, and then I think Felicia has a good question, that I think there are institutional venues, and I think for students, that's really important for us to know. I think for ourselves, for various reasons, and what I'm hearing you say is we can't always depend on that. And maybe there are other support networks. And I do think that all of us being many times in a classroom where really intense things happen. And the thing that you said, that transference thing, countertransference is really interesting, because I think we absorb stuff. I think there's probably not even, and that's the whole story that I was telling, was I never thought about that as my own mental health issue. And I, absorbing it, and I'm a talker, so it's all right. I deal with stuff, but being able to talk about these experiences and being able to acknowledge that, like, you go in every day and you listen to students talk about intense things that are going on, which I think segues into Felicia's question. Do you want to just ask it, or do you want?
Yeah, I mean, this obvious for me, this was my first semester, or last fall was my first semester teaching online. I was teaching mostly freshmen, and, many of them had been at school, high school, their last semester, working remotely. But, many of them felt really fragile. And I definitely got a sense from a number of them. One girl in particular told me that she was in a situation at home that was not good. And it was making it very difficult for her because she had anticipated not being at home. And so, given that we don't know how long this is going to be, like, what do you recommend in terms of just being aware of what's going on with your students, and then, how to help them feel comfortable kind of trying to express themselves while also working at home, where they maybe don't want their parents to know that they're gay, or that they, have a, dead body fetish or whatever, you know what I mean? Because they don't want their parents to think they're crazy. So yeah, that was kind of my thought. Yeah,
I think that is not just limited to art, but I can see how, especially being an art educator, you are confronted with that a lot more frequently. I think with the pandemic and the social isolation and limitation, I mean, I've seen that as well. When I taught, I see it with the young counseling professionals I supervise, even with their own the challenges. The thing that I will point out is that ultimately, each one of your students is incredibly resilient. They're incredibly resilient. So while it may be the issues that you maybe are exposed to, that they're struggling with and they may want support with, may trigger things with you, the stuff that gets triggered for you is for you to explore, as we mentioned. And you may want to, I don't think that it is within your job description or your responsibility to necessarily provide that support. You can provide them with resources, but your purpose is to educate, not necessarily protect them from their families. And support their growth. And part of their growth could be connecting them to adequate resources, whether the resources exist within the school or perhaps, I mean, typically, I don't know, does anybody not have a counseling center in their school? Yeah, you don't. Okay. We can talk about that later. But I mean, if there's no counseling center in school, depending on the setup, there are other ways. If somebody has insurance, if they're they're a student, they probably have some kind of insurance. There are online resources. Psychologytoday.com is US nationwide, has by far probably the largest listings of mental health professionals, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, and all the other ones that are licensed. So, and then people, ultimately, every single student has to find what fits right for them, just like each one of you has to find the right outlet for yourself, which is another reason why I suggest that I do suggest that you, if you feel, well, I don't think I think everybody should be in therapy because that's just an amazing resource. But depending on what kind of therapy, depending what you want to get out of therapy, right? You can then tailor. You will then look for a specific person. So perhaps you just want to be able to check in with someone. You can have a consultation with a person, and you want to come in maybe once a month for a checkup. You can probably find a therapist who offers that, right? And you will probably not want to go into psychoanalysis, because typically psychoanalysis requires 3 sessions per week, if not more, because that's the modality, that's how they work. You might want to work with a creative arts therapist, because or maybe you actually do not want to have that part of your process at all. And you may just want to either do movement, or you may want to do just talk therapy. It's completely up to you. The point is that there are a lot of different options, but ultimately you have to find what's right for you. Mm-hmm.
And I was going to say, Felicia, too, a lot of counseling, the recovery supports at VCU, for example, moved online. So they're doing Zoom one-on-ones and Zoom group meetings and all of that. So there are, everybody, one thing I've learned here is that all the adaptation that we've been doing around photography education, everybody has the same problem, right? So the counseling center, the recovery group that I advised, they were the first to move online, and they still support in that modality.
One more thing that I heard Marianna say at the beginning too was we may be having more of an effect than we realize, and sometimes just listening. And people who've come before know I have college students here, and I hear it from the other end. And I think sometimes, and not necessarily kids with really difficult situations, but I still think that not having to think you have to do it all. I don't know what you think, Felicia, but this idea that I do have that feeling like I want to fix everything for all my students, and being able to know, no, you can't, but we may be doing things we don't know we're doing, or maybe I'm just deluding myself.
No, I was very, for the one girl who basically told me she had PTSD, I was very, obviously her counselor, her advisor had actually told me that, I needed to cut her some slack because she was going through some things at home. And she did actually take time out to talk with me a bit about her situation and why it was just hard for her to be present in class. And I was just like, okay, I cut her some slack, with my grading, because she didn't turn in a lot of her things. So that was difficult on a certain level, but I also felt very afraid for her because, it just seemed like she was in a great bit of distress. But she did reassure me she was getting counseling, but on the other side of that, I had a student who was really going through that hard transition from high school into real life. And she was very, all of her work was she started out from the beginning of class through the end being very nostalgic. And then eventually what she revealed is that her grandmother had died from COVID at the beginning of the spring. And so that's really what she was processing through the whole class. And she made this really beautiful video that made everybody cry. But it was also wonderful because, I think it helped her, but yeah, it was hard. It was just really, I felt very bad for just the freshmen, who were, all geeked up to get in and, meet their peers, and then to kind of have to take it online. But I also think they are also far more resourceful than I probably give them credit for being. And they probably reach out to each other in ways that I didn't anticipate. But I was just very, very, very aware of the fragile nature of some of the students because of their home situation.
Yeah. I think, that's been a lot of what's triggered us to want to talk about this realization of this level of, fragility.
Yeah. And so again, I just want to emphasize the importance of boundaries, because boundaries do exist, not necessarily to push someone out of your awareness, but they're actually there to protect us and the other person, so that the other person will be forced almost sometimes to direct their need into appropriate channels. And so sometimes it's important for us to just be aware of that and not overextend, because then you will be drained. Because just as I mentioned this, I think on Saturday, when you walk into a classroom, right, you are the target. You are, if this is a psychoanalytic situation, the blank slate that all 20 some odd students are projecting their own stuff onto. So that is a lot to carry for semester to semester, class to class, right? And so, of course, they're relating to you based on their own projections, right? Based on their own expectations that you had nothing to do with. You just walked in to teach your class, right? To teach whatever it is that you're teaching. And so, again, boundaries are incredibly important, because you also don't want to necessarily enable these unhealthy dynamics that are taxing on you and not necessarily helpful for your students. Just again, working with people is incredibly difficult. It can be incredibly rewarding and fulfilling. At the same time, we need to acknowledge that it is challenging, especially, once again, for you being educators, because people will assume things, your students will assume things. And it is also impossible to keep yourself responsible for knowing everything that there is, because you also are human, which brings me back to the previous point of the importance of having support for yourself. And also recognizing your own humanity. I, as a therapist, do not know everything there is to know. I am an immigrant. I have an accent. My last name is challenging for people to pronounce at times. And guess what? It's incredibly difficult for me to pronounce other people's names and say some words. And, the people sometimes I have clients that come in and they present questions or issues that I'm just like, I'm kind of like dumbfounded by. And I'm really well trained, frankly. And I will continue to be trained. And that is my professional responsibility, to continue to educate myself, but never at the expense of getting defensive. Like I cannot continue to work getting defensive and assuming that, I know better than somebody else. Yes, I am biased. I have my biases, and there will be times that I will not know, and I will not be able to provide adequate support. And hopefully I'll be able to recognize that and refer somebody to somebody else, right? And navigate those boundaries. And I think that it's a similar situation for all of you.
Thank you.
Thanks. That's great. I mean, it's true.
So as most of you who join us regularly know that I am our timekeeper. We are now officially over time. I wanted to take a minute and thank Marianna for being with us today. Thank you for all your sage advice. I will certainly take any of the links and questions that have been asked and put them on our blog next week. Feel free to drop anything in there over the next minute or so. And thank you again.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yeah.
So lovely to see some of you again and meet a lot of you.
Thanks,
Have a good
everybody.
one.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Have a
Take
great
care,
week.
everyone.
We'll see you tomorrow night.